When we're talking about payrolls, I think one of the things that makes it so difficult is immigration. And research coming out of Brookings showed that when we're getting these really high payroll prints at the beginning part of the recovery, one of the reasons why we could see such high prints was because we had so many people coming into the country, both seeking asylum and through illegal means. And so I think it really complicates things. I mean, it could mean we'll see an extra 100,000 jobs in a month that we just didn't anticipate. Yeah, sure. On the household side, so for the unemployment rate, that's just a story of non-response. And you saw this coming out of Governor Bowman's comments from the other day where she said, look, we just can't rely on the U3 like we used to. And this is true of surveys across the spectrum, whether we're talking about the survey of consumer finances coming out of the Fed or we're talking about consumer confidence. People just don't answer surveys the way they used to. And I think that makes forecasting that much more difficult. Yeah.
Okay, so forecasting is tough, but then you get the data and it paints a story for those who have to make decisions around it, like the Federal Reserve. The market today is reading this data as a sign that this is not an economy that needs the Fed to ease policy, as they have been doing. Some on the street are suggesting no cuts this year. Perhaps a hike could be back on the table. How do you see it, Ben?
Yeah, so the way that markets seem to be looking at this is that we will be in a period of an elongated pause, and the Fed will need some sort of drastic data print to push us off that. So you either need to see something happen on the inflation side to get us back into the hiking cycle, or potentially, we'll need to see several prints of weakness in order to see cuts that might materialize. Right now, I think markets are expecting cuts either in the summer or potentially in the early fall in the September meeting. But for right now, it feels like we're in an elongated pause.
Well, of course, there are a lot of folks who will tell you there's a big tank of gasoline that Donald Trump's about to pour on that fire, and that reinflation will be the buzzword next year after Trump tax cuts are extended, tariffs are implemented, deficits explode. Where are you on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would describe this economy as the don't mess it up economy. And it was similar to the last time. I mean, Trump came into office. The unemployment rate had been falling. It was 4.7% when he was inaugurated, but had been falling for years. The economy right now is even better than it was then. So you've got household balance sheets are really strong. Debt relative to disposable income is really low. There is some bad news as far as transitions into delinquencies on credit cards. But you really have to squint in order to find any sort of story which suggests that the U.S. consumer is going to slow down anytime soon. And then you're seeing nearly a perfect labor market. I mean, we're seeing real wage gains. You've got plenty of jobs. You didn't have that type of imbalance like you saw in 2020 when they're just, we're just so many openings per worker. So we have this really strong, healthy labor market. And that means, my advice, not that Trump's asking for it, but it's like, just don't mess this up. And so there's real concerns around tariff policy. There's real concerns around over-borrowing through a reconciliation bill. And I think there's real concerns about being too strict on immigration policy and possibly seeing net out migration, which is something we haven't seen in my lifetime.
Well, so as we consider this notion that maybe everything is just right and we're kind of in this Goldilocks phase right now, it doesn't seem, though, Trump necessarily agrees with that. He had a press conference in Mar-a-Lago earlier this week in which he said interest rates are far too high. And we actually asked the former House Financial Services Committee Chairman, Patrick McHenry, about that on this program earlier this week. This is what he told us.
Mean tweets, that does not make monetary policy. And the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve have long terms as Congress designed so they can have this longer term view. And I think Jay Powell's done a fabulous job as chair of the Fed. But this president will speak his mind publicly where other presidents privately complained. And that is a big distinction between now and what was then.
So when we consider that distinction and this question of the independent operation of monetary policy setting in the United States for the Fed, what would it mean if the data is suggesting the Fed can stand pat, but the president of the United States is saying, no, interest rates need to go lower?
Well, this has been in my mind in part because you saw President Carter's funeral yesterday and thinking about some of the lessons that came out of that administration.
Volcker.
And Volcker. I mean, so one of the lessons that came out with, look, if you want to fight inflation, the first, second, and third best thing to do is to appoint a credible Fed chair and let that chair do their job. And so, I think that a lot of people do worry about Fed independence under this administration, but that's something we'll probably not have to worry about until the middle part of 2026 when Powell's term is up. When you look at the names of possible people who would be considered for Fed chair, they are all credible people like Kevin Hassett and Kevin Warsh and Mark Summerlin and people, Larry Lindsey, people, some of them have political backgrounds, but all credible people. And so obviously, Donald Trump doesn't want to repeat some of the sins of the 1970s, the early part of the decade before Volcker.
Nor does the Fed.
Nor does the Fed. My sense is that you have to look at what Donald Trump does, not so much what he says. Whether you're talking about a trade war, or you're talking about a corporate tax cut. I mean, sometimes his bark is much worse than the fight.
This is the seriously and literally thing.
Oh, yes. I've heard that before. Well,
yeah.
you said something important. You referred to immigration, and we're still trying to get a sense of how serious or literal Donald Trump is about mass deportation. Let's say we close the border. Let's say this mass deportation takes place. Caps are not lifted on H-1Bs. Where's the job market?
Yeah, so one thing that I realized coming out of research out of Brookings was that you don't have to have this oppressive deportation scheme in order to get net out migration. So you can do other things, right? So you can put more agents at the border. You can transition people who are here legally into illegal status. They're going to leave. The rhetoric, I think, has a chilling effect. And you could have people who are here legally who decide they want to leave because it's no longer a hospitable place to legal immigrants. And so pretty quickly, even without these mass deportation programs, you can get to net out migration, a shrinking of the labor force, which might precipitate something which we thought we might see in the last administration but didn't, which is a wage price spiral. And so if we get to the point where the labor market is so tight that you start to anticipate future tightness down the road, companies start giving raises prematurely, consumers start buying in anticipation of, then that's something which we haven't dealt with in a long time. And that possibly coupled with a non-credible Fed, or a Fed which is seen as being political, could be terrible news for inflation.
I want to talk about something else regarding the incoming administration and those affiliated with it that has been in the news this week. Elon Musk talking about the Department of Government Efficiency, maybe pulling back expectations a little bit. Maybe it's not going to be $2 trillion in spending cuts, but if they aim for $2, they could get $1 trillion. Even if we assume that level is achievable, $1 trillion is not an inconsequential amount of money. When they're talking about pulling back the scope and scale of the federal government, what would that actually do economically if that drastic kind of cut is implemented?
Well, it depends on the nature of the cuts. And my guess is that based on the type of cuts they're considering, which is non-defense discretionary spending, which is a pretty small share of the overall federal budget, these are the type of things that, A, tend to make us a richer country. So investments in education, R&D, science spending, cancer research that improves health. I think that that's more or less just a hit on our national prosperity down the road. If they're talking about cuts to Medicare, to Social Security, that has serious implications for the well-being of retired households, but less so for the future prosperity of our country.
This was the final jobs report while Joe Biden is in office. What should Donald Trump prepare for in the early phases of his administration? We'll get, I guess, what would technically be Joe Biden's last jobs report or partial month while he's in office. How do you come off data like this?
Well, I mean, you're handed a terrific economy. And I would just encourage those who are in policymaking positions to move slowly. When it comes to tariff policy, I looked to the last administration, the last Trump administration, where the average tariff rate went up about 150 basis points. It was not a trade war. It was a trade war with China. So the average tariff on Chinese imports went from 3% up to 11%. So certainly consequential for China. But if you're talking about goods that came from anywhere but China, the tariff movements were almost zero. And so my hope is that he doesn't come in too strong with changes in our trade policy. My hope is that they are as worried about the deficit as many economists are, and you don't see big increases in issuance coming out of a reconciliation package. I think right now markets are expecting around $5 trillion in new borrowing. If you came in with $7 trillion, I think that would roil financial markets.